including the one we're working on today, I don't think is underground at all. So.
Yeah, so if you have any questions, please drop them in the chat, and Sebastian will pass them along to us. But we've also got a few questions from other folks to kind of start us off with, like, thinking about how do we design dungeons. So we got one from Chris, which was, what are the essential elements of a good, memorable dungeon, not just a balanced one? So what makes a memorable dungeon for you, Jordan?
Well, I'm all about the hook, you know? You got to have a good hook for the dungeon. You got to have a reason for the people to be in there. That reason can be making money or, you know, getting rid of dangerous monsters, but you still want it to be, if that's what your dungeon's about, then you want it to be focused on that. We were talking before the stream started, I don't run a lot of dungeons in the games that I run, but I did get to play some of the, once you actually got to the Tomb of Annihilation part of Tomb of Annihilation, they had all these little mini dungeons, and I really liked them because they were really focused on, they really felt like the challenge dungeons in Zelda games, you know, where you go in, you have a very specific purpose, you've got only a few rooms to worry about, and then you come out, you know. So I like a smaller, juicier dungeon over a sprawling one that has vast empty spaces and no story. You know?
Yeah, I definitely agree. I love environmental storytelling in dungeons and, like, finding the story of the dungeon. That's super important to me. But also, I do think if you just put a weird little guy in there, people love a weird little guy. that is one of my top things to have in a dungeon.
I mean, we should put that on the whiteboard at work, that Humblewood equals weird little guys, because I think that's
like a lot of the, like, my best dungeon running experiences is, like, the players have picked up some weird little guy and now they have to either keep them alive or be deeply irritated by them. That's one of my favorite little things to throw in there into a dungeon.
I think on the note of balance, like if you're running a classic dungeon, like a real, like an underground adventure with a network of tunnels and all this kind of stuff, you can, in my mind, worry less about balance because there should be ways around everything. If the place is got tunnels and it's big, and you have lower level monsters in there with high level monsters, the lower level monsters aren't getting murdered by the high level monsters, so they must have ways to get around safely. And that is something that can be interesting about classic dungeons for me, is that the ecosystem can kind of run, and then the characters are like parasites in it that are going in and ruining the balance there, you know.
It's the delicious in dungeon meshy principle. We can all learn from.
I mean, watch that show for lots of good dungeon advice. So.
Yeah, it's like how to build a dungeon masterclass. So another question, like, what are some good ways to weave a dungeon's environment into combat? I think we're probably gonna take a specific look at that in the dungeon we're going to be working on later in the stream, because it is a very environmentally focused dungeon. But what do you think? What are some ways of kind of making the dungeon work for you?
Again, like, you know, an apartment complex is a dungeon. Basically anything where you've got a series of rooms that you have to get through is a dungeon. And so the variety of things that can happen because of the environment during combat is endless. Like, I'm a firm believer in giving everyone layer actions, whether they are a big boss monster like a dragon or not. There is in my mind, there would be no group of kobolds or goblins that did not have a bunch of traps ready in their lair, you know? And so think about what the creatures in the dungeon are protecting and think about how they're going to protect that. Because no trap or no environmental thing that's set up by monsters is done without a reason. Being a challenge for the heroes is not a reason for a kobold to build a trap. So what are they hiding? What are they keeping there? You know, I think that think that things that are there purposefully make a lot more will feel a lot realer for your players. And
let them figure out ways around it, like from the context clues, which can be really fun. Yeah.
How about you, Verity? Any suggestions?
I think it's like environment and mood and tone. Like that's what I would kind of add to this, is not just like if you have a combat scenario, obviously it's like fight the monster. That's simple. But I do like a alternative combat objectives, and then if you tie that into mood and tone. So is this a horror dungeon? Is this a fairly lighthearted, like comedic dungeon? And then tying in the combat objective to that tone and mood, and then like pushing that through everything they've faced in the dungeon up to the kind of final denouement at the end. Like that's something that I really like to play with.
If you think of like kind of one of the classic dungeons from fantasy literature of getting into Smaug's lair, Smaug is not even something that can be fought by Bilbo at that point. And so he is basically just the lair actions that they are running away from. You know, if you're stumped for lair actions, just turn one of the put a monster that's too strong into the place, and just consider all of their actions lair actions, because and that, you know, you need to telegraph things like this to your players, because players will often just see a monster and think, okay, well, it's here, so we must need to fight it. Yeah, but yeah, examples like that for movies and video games. Video games do it very well a lot of time, like as far as making that end battle in a series of rooms interesting. You know, even if it's just neurotoxin leaking in at the end of Portal 1 or whatever, like, you know, it's something. So
yeah, and like taking the things you've learned through the environment into that final room challenge, and applying them, like, if you're a smart player. Yeah. So kind of going on to like a more of a kind of open-ended question. We have a question from Victoria. What is your favorite dungeon that you've used, either in the D&D or something you've designed yourself?
Like I said, I actually quite like the Tomb of Annihilation dungeons. They're like 5-room dungeons, really. And that was mostly, I think, because they put a lot of work into puzzles and interesting puzzles, and they had handouts for all the puzzles, and so we actually had to solve puzzles, which was nice. That's a hard thing to do when you don't have a whole game design team behind you to write those things. In my personal games, I don't run a lot of dungeons, although I do, like I said, I stick to a dungeon, a building, like an inn with a bunch of rooms in it. You should be thinking of that as a dungeon. You know, but instead of
a whole city can be a dungeon.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, the best cities are mega dungeons that you are just finding your way through. My favorite like hook for it was just one room, but it was this cubic room that I designed that I know is exciting. Bear with me, but it's just a cube. But it had this gadget in the middle that gave each of the walls, each of the surfaces of the inside of this room, its own gravity. Basically, it took place in this a big city, and there wasn't a lot of room. So this artificer inventor created a way to basically have his laboratory on the main floor, on the ground, and then on the ceiling, his bedroom. And all he had to do was kind of walk up the wall to get wherever he needed to go. And so I designed it and then unfolded it, drew it as a map, but as an unfolded cube, and drew each of the sections of it from the perspective as though you were standing on that wall. So like on one wall, you could see the drawing of a bookcase as though it was like lying on its side. But that's just because when you were walking on that wall, you would see. And arrows started doing weird things when they crossed gravity. They would change direction and stuff. Yeah. And players had to kind of learn. The players had to kind of learn the weirdness of that room. Yeah. Once they realized they could easily tip things and throw things like across places, they started using the furniture and stuff in the room a lot more. So yeah, I mean that's just a very simple idea that that is literally one room in a building, but I really like that for a boss fight. I was proud of it.
Yeah. I I quite like running dungeons in my own games. I did run a large chunk of Dungeon of the Mad Mage, which in terms of like learning about dungeons, you can't really go wrong. There's like good things and bad things in there. Lots of weird little guys, which I appreciate. And yeah, it's a real kind of masterclass in like what is Mega Dungeon, and looking at what the things that work and the things that work less well. One thing I really like about it is that it allows you to apply your own narrative, because it doesn't really have a narrative, which is kind of the flip side of having like a really story-driven dungeon. If you have a completely blank dungeon, as long as which makes sense within itself, but it doesn't tie into the player's stories, you can find a lot of places to kind of make them be important in this dungeon, and especially as they start to get entangled in various threads that are existing within the space. So yeah, I do enjoy that one. That's quite fun. Yeah, and then we have a question actually from Sebastian, who's running the stream today. How do you design dungeon puzzles that are fun to solve?
I'm going to leave this to you, Verity, or at least get you to start on it, because you are very passionate and a fan of puzzles. So
I do like puzzles. I often say about the work that we do at Hit Point Press is that we'll do the not fun parts so that you can have fun. Designing a puzzle can be very difficult, especially making one that hits the right level, because you really don't want people to come up against a puzzle and bounce off it. Like, that's not fun. And so trying to design a puzzle that like the majority of people will have fun with, and also an alternative route around that puzzle. Like every puzzle I ever design always has like a secondary option, which might not be great for you. I once designed a puzzle that involved you could get around by stabbing yourself with a magical sword, which the sword was part of the puzzle. And it's like, if you really hate this, there is an option, but it's going to suck. But yeah, that's like making sure that there is an alternate option for people who don't like puzzles. But some people do like puzzles. And I think like just looking at the principles of puzzle design, like humans have been making puzzles for like hundreds of thousands of years. And you don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are some really strong like principles of puzzles and types of puzzle. And then it's about finding a type of puzzle that makes sense in the context, because for me, I don't like it when you go into a room and it's like, oh, here's the puzzle. Like, it's like, why did this wizard put a tic-tac-toe board in there, like, as their security system? Like, that doesn't really do anything for me. And so I tend to put like I tend to lean on sort of like weirder magic things, or like this is something like it can be a ritual, even like these were the sacred steps you had to follow to like go through the sacred labyrinth to worship this deity and it's like now thousands of years later you have to reproduce those steps by solving this puzzle. So I think trying to find ways that make the puzzle part of the story, and then just making sure that it's simpler than you think it will need to be. That's the other thing. Like puzzles for small children and D&D players. So everyone can enjoy.
Yeah, I come from the school of thought of like situations that putting characters into situations where there isn't one or even two fixed ways out, because it's more important. It's in the long run, it's more important that the players feel like they were clever than it is that you get to feel clever because you came up with this fun crossword puzzle or whatever. And so I will often, instead of puzzles, I'll do strange traps that they get stuck in, but then I won't have an actual solution for the trap. And I'll just like listen to what the players are doing and let them try things. You put a little pressure on so that they're focusing on it, and then eventually someone will come up with something that sounds smart. I made this I made this trap room that was just a 60 feet of looped corridor that had been designed with near invisible portals on either side, so that when they walked off the edge, they just wrapped around to the other side. And at first, it just felt like that they were just trapped in this never-ending tunnel. And eventually, a gelatinous cube dropped into the perfectly square tunnel and was just forever following them. And then one of them decided to run ahead to see if there was anything up ahead, and ended up looping back around behind the gelatinous cube. And then they realized there was a loop. And so they started looking for the gap. And then one of the characters looked at their character, the wizard looked at her character sheet and saw that if she cast, it's a spell where you create like a protective dome it's basically like for camping, magic camping. Tiny hut, yeah.
Yeah.
That magic gets canceled out inside of it or whatever. And so she said, can I cast that where we found the gap? And by the letter of the spell, that doesn't necessarily exactly how it works. But I said, sure. And she cast it, and it canceled out the weird thing. And they actually found the room. They were trapped in like a magic item. And they found the room where the magic item was being stored that they were trapped in. And so I could not have come up with that solution on my own, sitting at home, saying they're going to have to cast Leomin's tiny hut in order to escape from
in
this.
a specific space. Yeah.
And talk about a spell that never gets used, but they felt so good about it afterwards, and the wizard got to cast a spell that they hadn't, so that's not a philosophy for every single puzzle, but keep that in mind for when you're doing things. Maybe they come up with solutions 3 from your solutions 1 and 2, and you could just run with it. If it makes sense to them, then what does it matter?
I think we've even occasionally put that into, I think in Heckna, we put lines of like, or any other reasonable solution, because that is a really useful philosophy.
It is a little different when you're writing something for a book, because you don't want to leave the GM flapping in the wind on without any kind of solutions, because the opposite can happen. The players are absolutely stumped and you need to guide them. But as a general rule of GMing thumb, like there shouldn't be any wrong answers. So,
yeah, I once got stuck back when I was playing at university. I once got stuck in a dungeon for I think 4 weeks. We were stuck in this dungeon, and it was it was very cool. It was, but very complicated. It was 2 overlapping dimensions, and when you went and they were all made out of hexagons, and when you went out of a certain door, it would like switch you between the dimensions. So you essentially had to map 2 separate dungeons and then realize which room you were in. And also like a specter of death was following us, because of course it was. But it took us so long to work it out. We were just like, why are we stuck in this terrible place? So this like, I think that was maybe a little bit over on the complexity scale. But it was very fun when we finally solved it. So like satisfying, kind of like, yes, we did it. Feeling that's what we're really aiming for, right? It's like, it's not about how clever we are as puzzle designers, it's how clever the players feel when they crack it, which is really, really fun to think of. And then we've got another question about how do you gauge a dungeon's length in terms of playtime when designing it?
I'm for sure the less is more camp. Again, it comes, Go ahead.
The 5-room dungeon is a classic for a reason. Like, I think starting from that as a starting point, and then kind of scaling up or down as you need for like the story of the dungeon. And it's very hard to know how long people will take to get through various things, because they'll come up with different solutions, or they'll spend an hour and a half planning to walk through a door, classic D&D things. And so I don't worry too much about that, but I do like to make sure that the dungeon itself has like a nice pace to it. So it's like filled with interesting things and not a lot of empty rooms, unless the empty rooms are setting up some kind of horror scenario.
It can feel like in a movie or if you were actually building out a world, it would feel a little maybe artificial to have things all pointing in one direction. But you kind of have to do that. You should You should really be rethinking any room that you're adding to a dungeon that doesn't direct to the point, because players will see things that aren't there, or they will interpret. We've all been there where we've said something or we've described something for flavor, and it's become the obsession of the party. And now you have to like build a lore around your throwaway.
I swear I saw
line.
a red herring. Yeah, with my perception check. I'm going to hunt it down.
So, I think that you can have a lot of fun with that again in a home game. But when you're designing stuff for a book,
you have to be careful.
We have limitations like page count and word count. So we doubly have to decide. Oh, this room is made. Even a room that is cool and leads to where like your goal, it might still have to get cut. There may be another room that just gets you to the point better, and then you learn that you have to get rid of that. So. Realistically, I think the only way to learn the pacing of your dungeon is to playtest it once at least, which is not always a luxury that we have. So
yeah, and even then, like different groups are gonna pick different routes. Like especially if you've built a dungeon with multiple routes through it, which I do quite like. I like putting that choice in the like the hands of the players. Like if you find this information and you make an informed decision about which door you enter by, like that's a very cool.
The Shock and Stormcrag, we came up with something like that, where there's multiple ways to the end of the dungeon, and each one
like
has
on a micro scale kind of
Each one of them has different advantages that certain people would be good at and other people's weren't, and they also give up certain things. Like if you don't take the risk you're underwater, you might not get a part of a magic item, for example.
Or you might alert the creature at the end of the dungeon if you make a lot of noise getting through this certain obstacle. Yeah.
Always have the easy route. Be more consequences for the players.
Yes.
You want hard things to pay off for them. So.
So speaking of dungeons, shall we? Unless there are any questions from the chat. No. Okie dokie. Let's dive into talking about a specific dungeon, which will be in Humblewood 2. And you can probably see here on this first page, I pulled up a couple of inspiration photos. The Amping Treehouse in Tainan is one of the coolest places I've ever been, and I love the fact that it is it's basically a giant warehouse that has been completely consumed by a banyan tree, and almost to the point that like the tree is taken on the form of what was once there. It's a fantastic place, and you can like walk all inside it and up around on the top of it. And then we also have like one of the Angkor Wat temples with a strangling fig here. And so I think you can probably guess what the kind of environmental theme of the dungeon is going to be. So this dungeon is set in the Tangle Wilds, so the jungle region that we're going to be covering in Humblewood 2. If we just scroll down, you'll see what we've got so far, which isn't a whole lot, but it is a start. So we're getting into some kind of lore stuff here. Basically, this is a dungeon in the back half of the adventure. This is one of the last dungeons that the players will face. And so they'll know a lot about the lore and history. But one of the things we wanted to show off in this section is the history of the Fizzers, which were this kind of loose organization of scientists and engineers who kind of use magic and science together like over 1,000 years ago. And so the hook, or the kind of the kernel of this dungeon, is that one of these Fizzers who specialized in like plant magic, which ties in with one of our subclasses for the Gadgeteer class, because we want to fold in the cheese. We want it all to kind of rhyme together. They basically have become the dungeon by becoming one with the plants that have overgrown what was once their kind of temple or laboratory. And And so we have like this is going to be combat and dungeon survival and traps as like the main kind of vibe here, and also like magical plant life. We have some cool plants, plant monsters. This is a place to like show them off, and then the other kind of like thing I really want to try and get this dungeon to do, which is because it's a living dungeon. The plant life is sentient in a way because it is the mind of the fizzer is still inside it. I want the walls to move. How are we going to depict this? That is something we still need to figure out. It might be a case of the map having kind of dotted lines, and like certain walls will close and open depending on the player's actions. But I want it to be like once you've gone inside, you can't get out until you solve it, and also the sense of like, you turn back around, that corridor you were in isn't there anymore. I think that's a fun vibe to play with in a dungeon. And then I think we've got the kind of the final battle or final challenge is the skeleton of the fizzer, which is going to be kind of consumed with the plants and kind of become one with the plants. And then we get into some kind of emotional stuff. We have regret, we have anger, and it plays into larger themes that are going to be in the book. So like power and what you have to give up to gain power. And then just some notes about like speak with dead and speak with plants are very useful spells. So maybe we want something else that make sure that players have access to that before they get here, potentially. And just the kind of the success failure state of this dungeon, like completing some kind of ritual will allow the fizzer spirit to fully merge with the dungeon and return to the great rhythm. And they get some kind of reward, and we get a cool scene, or they just have to fight their way out. It's not going to be happy. So it doesn't always have to be a giant combat at the end. They have an option to do something else, even though there will be combat in this dungeon. Any kind of thoughts where you would start out with that?
I think the first piece of advice that I've given people is that you don't want to start with writing. I don't think, believe it or not, you want to start maybe with a sketch at the very least, just to figure out, especially with something like this. This isn't the hook is the moving dungeon. So this isn't something that we're going to plot out using a 5-room dungeon very easily. And so I would probably, I have an idea in my head, like, of how I would start laying out this dungeon to make it so that the dungeon master could move walls around. Like you said, I do like that idea of it. Once players move past a certain point, then you trigger this changing of the dungeon. And then I think pitfalls you would need to avoid is making that feel bad. The first time it happens, where they're standing in a hallway and then the wall grows in front of them and blocks the path, that's going to be cool. Yeah. The second, the third, the 10th time that happens, it's not going to feel cool anymore.
No. You want it to happen cinematically, I think. One thing I'd like to, probably a puzzle that I would put in is the party is in a room and a wall starts growing and separates them, and now they have to find a way to reunite with each other. That's probably something I'd throw in there as like a twist on the walls coming in.
I think you could also make a smaller map feel bigger, because rooms can combine, and it would be cool if they could see, at first a room looks new, but they realize, oh no, it merged with this room that we saw. It basically just grew a room that we saw before, and there would be landmarks. So maybe there's hints of maybe like a certain type of flower grows stronger near the center or something like that, and they can start using something like that as a hook.
I also think that because this was once a building, And there will still be elements of it, like stones that will be there, and kind of decorative elements. I think that's something we could play with as well. So it's like the vines, the living green walls are moving, but the stones aren't. So people can start to like recognize, like, oh, we think this is different, but actually it's the same.
There could be some, and that could mean that there's maybe one room or something that doesn't change, so that they could find a safe harbor almost, to knowing that room will, or they could safely put something there and knowing that it won't, knowing they'll be able to find their way back or something.
The classic kind of chalk or thread or hand, like there's lots of ways you can, as soon as you kind of realize that you're in a moving space, hopefully people will start doing something. And also we have the potential of having an NPC in this dungeon who's maybe using those techniques themselves. And so the players stumbling across those if they're not already doing them themselves.
Still trapped there, but has a little bit more information about what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. Kind of surviving in this space. So I put a couple of headers here just before we jump over to sketchy time. So the purpose of the dungeon, I think a lot of this is covered by the wireframe. But I'm going to make some notes. So I want to deepen the themes of this is also a it's a little creepy. It's a little spooky. So unsettle the players. And challenge them to gather information and make good choices. And then the other thing is the scale of the dungeon. So as you said, like 5-room dungeon is classic, but it may not fit for this. It's not really a linear thing exactly.
Just back to the purpose, we also they need to get they're trying to get something out. We're not going to go into too much detail about it, but there is something here that will help them with the rest of their journey.
Yeah, that is important. Okay, and the scale of the dungeon. I think what you said about making a small space feel big by changing it is important to keep in mind. I don't think we need to push the number of rooms like super high, so that because like rooms can change. And I don't just thinking ahead to how I would lay that out. It might even be that like a room has 2 variations depending on, and so it's like room 3, like in setting A, setting B, so that doubles essentially the type number of rooms without doubling the number of rooms. But I do feel like this is a fairly large place. I think it's not sub 20 rooms for sure. I don't think it needs to be 20 rooms, but maybe it ends up at like 10.
I think also by the nature of it, and the fact that I assume that the spirit of the fizzer wants to trap people in it to a degree, and confuse people. I think that you're probably looking at a good amount of like hallway equivalent, tunnel equivalent, as well. So those are rooms. Like you have to think about them as rooms, and not just a way to get between 2 things that are happening. Otherwise, you may as well just not mention them. But
especially with the kind of like moving ability of the tunnels.
Yeah, because an easy spooky kind of move is a tunnel getting longer while they're walking in it, and that's something that you could do. Like you could have, instead of rooms changing, they're being pulled a little further apart. So that's another kind of dial to turn that isn't going to like overwhelm the GM by saying, a 50-foot hallway is now 70 feet long, like that's not going to open.
No, and you put like some kind of combat encounter in there, and it's like at the end of that combat, it's grown by X amount, and then it stops. Kind of spooky. Kind of speaking to the interaction between the plant monsters and the dungeon itself, that they're all kind of part of the same ecosystem. I like that. I should take a note of it.
And then mind games, like it's not always blocking off ways, it's also opening new passages for them. And so if you are trapped in a room or you think you're at a dead end and then a door opens for you, do you go through it? Like,
yeah.
it's got trap written all over it, right? But this, what level of intelligence, like from 3 to 18, do you see this dungeon having? Fizzers are supposed to be fairly clever.
Yeah, the Fizzers are smart, but this is also someone who they're not necessarily a person the person they once were.
Yeah, they
are also a plant, and I think their priorities are a plant's priorities, right? But they have a lot more ability over, like they want to grow, they want to thrive, and I think they kind of want to. Maybe be left alone. Like if you merge yourself with a plant dungeon, you're probably not the most social person. Really into plants. But at the same time, we have there's a kind of wider global threat at this point in the adventure, and so I think that is like riling this entity up, and making it scared, and so there is that fear that's also there. And then if we say that the success is like completing this death ritual, is there some element of them that wants the party to succeed and work out that they need to be freed? And then is there some other element of it that is like just angry and scared? And it kind of oscillates between the two.
It could be the things that are happening in the world are pulling out some of its more, humanity is not the right word because there aren't humans, but you know what I mean, like that their old selves getting drawn to the surface a little bit more because things in the world are drumming up memories of, that they've specifically gotten themselves into the situation to forget about,
to avoid.
Yeah, and I like that it could lead to a conversation with them, or once they're weakened in the battle or whatever. So maybe there is room to get hints as to who they were before as you're going through.
Yeah, because I think this was like their lab, their space, and so even there will be some like environmental storytelling for sure. Sticky. So even though we don't know exactly how many rooms, I'm gonna rough in 10 plus rooms at the moment, and that's including corridors. Which are very easy to like, oh yeah, it'll be 5 rooms. Oh, but also you've got to have passages, and suddenly you have 10. Okay. Shall we pop over to our sketchy place and hopefully start sketching?
Sure. The first thing that came to mind for me is just starting with. This is going to be interesting. Starting with just your basic maze. I don't know how well this will come across, and saying like this is the basic structure of the with the heart in the center.
Like this kind of flower, petal, seed, like all of these kind of plant based.
We have reached the smallest a square can be in this. Oh no.
Draw a square.
Oh no, I moved a thing. Okay. Sorry, we're trying this for the first time. Yeah.
One wonky square. Yeah.
That scribble in the middle is the boss.
Yeah.
And then I like the idea of the dotted lines and maybe with a letter sort of associated with them. And so it may be that one room this is one room right now, but then it has the dotted line, here that once they trigger it, you say now there's a wall. Now this is 2 rooms or whatever. That was the first thing that came into my head. Keep it very maze-like, so that's something familiar to players, but then. And then everything's just being rearranged within this structure, keeping that I think fairly simple for the GM.
Yeah. I also like the idea, like the kind of even just keeping it kind of square and giving it this unnatural shape. Like this is not a shape that appears in nature, and yet it is made of plants. Like that in itself is kind of telling something.
A murderous hedge maze is a good hook, and hedge mazes are incredibly unnatural structures. As far as nature doesn't grow into that way, like you said. So
no, I do love a maze. They're very cool. And also, I feel like this shape gives us lots of opportunities for multiple entrances. So maybe it's not 4, but maybe it's 2, and that I think kind of lets players have that choice, and it'll play out differently. I think this is a kind of dungeon which you can't necessarily. It's not going to be linear. It's not. It's going to be very player dependent, and I think leaning into that rather than trying to guide the players into a really strict sequence of events is gonna work out well here. Yeah. So if we've got maybe if we work out from the heart. So if we think about the final encounter chamber, we know that there's a skeleton in there. We know there's angry plants. I think one thing I'm probably going to want is if you just start burning these walls, it goes badly for you. And it just starts dropping some kind of seed pods that explode or whatever. So there is some consequence for it.
Could also start constricting because it's just trying to choke out the oxygen from the flame you just set, smothering you and the flames.
Yeah.
I think playing with claustrophobia would obviously be a good.
That's real large. Okay, let's see my consequences. This is not a good idea. There we go.
I think you can write text, but
yeah, it's just real big, unfortunately.
I see.
Yeah. Okay. So
I think the dungeon depends on the GM having a list of moves they can make.
Yeah. Okay. So if we go with this this kind of basic shape, I'm gonna take a screenshot of that, and I'm going to pull it back over into our Google Doc. So, and then if I do this, we start to get a sense of rooms that we might want to have. And I think here at this stage, all I want from a room is the hook of the room, right? I'm not going to start writing really loud text and huge amounts of things, but we've already discussed quite a few of these. So I think we can put tunnel getting longer. Plus combat encounter to end effect. Then we can also have wall closing. I think wall closing behind is that's just going to happen in the first thing. I don't know if that's, but we can have a split the party plus puzzle to Right. And I think maybe there you kind of lean into the theming and the idea of this person having combined themselves with a plant. And it's like, you want to be reunited. They have been united with plants. So there's some kind of magical doohickey in here. Okay. Then we've also got, let's copy this. So we've got a room opening up.
Yeah, even if there's like they come across a room that's got multiple exits or something, because they won't feel like they're spoiled for choice for a lot of it. Like that's pretty interesting.
Yeah. So room with multiple exits, and some of these will probably end up being combined. But it's just nice to have them to start out with, and then
we don't have a constricting room yet, right?
No, not yet. Let's get a constricting room for sure.
That seems pretty obvious.
Yeah,
as something that would happen.
Yeah.
Or a deadly neurotoxin room.
Yeah, spooky pollen.
Yeah.
I think also up here we're going to want to have the remind ourselves to put in the exploring the temple of braided vines, and this is going to be your features. So this will be where you have a bullet point list of the light. Like the room size doesn't really work here because we're messing around with it so much. But this would also be like consequences for damaging the dungeon.
Yeah, and you could put a cap on how tall the rooms get too. I mean,
yeah.
Something I was thinking is maybe I like you were saying as reactionary, like obviously you set things on fire, that's bad. I think there'll be an instinct to try and hack their way through a wall. And I think there's a lever there that we could have where players damaging or like attacking the dungeon, like the walls directly, is what causes a lot of the combat encounters. Like basically like an organism, you attack it sends out things to defend. And so that's a lever they can learn the first time the fighter tries to like chop through some vines, 2d4 little vine monsters show up.
For some reason, I just imagine little seed pods with legs just drop, and they're just come off you.
We might be. Are there any blights in the SRD?
That is a good question.
Because they probably do the job. They've got them at a few different scales. I think they do the job pretty well. With just a reflavoring.
Yeah, like a nice SRD blight. Let's see.
But But yeah, I like that. So they can learn not to attack the walls, and you still want some, like you're in your tunnel getting longer, or having a bigger monster or something show up. But that's a fun. Don't touch the walls becomes like a thing that they have to learn to think about doing.
Yeah, and like because this is plants, you can really play around with like poison and like even charm effects, like kind of weird pollens and things. I think the big plant monster we have written up so far is the golden sun eater, which is this kind of pitcher plant that attracts you with its delicious smell, and that'd be a fun. Like I definitely want to put that in here. This is where it gets to shine. Okay. Okie dokie. So, and then I think, we definitely need right at the end, for sure, the heart. So I think this is the vision of the dead and choice to help or hurt. And this will be where you put all the kind of consequences. And then at the end, you just have like the conclusions. And also here, we've got to have the reward. And I think we'll probably want to sprinkle like some rewards elsewhere as well. Like as a fizzer location, I think there's some weird old tech in here.
Yeah, something that they can pry out or they spot beyond the vines, like which could tempt them to hack their way into it, which could cause problems with the monsters showing up. But there's a reward for doing it. Yeah, it'd be interesting if like there was chunks of stone and fizzer tech that got swept up into the vines as they move around, sort of like someone caught on waves or whatever, and so that could move around the walls. They could spot something in one room and then it shifts, and they have to figure out where it ended up, and then in another room. Yeah,
especially if we want them to like perform some kind of ritual, like if it's the thing that the fizzer didn't quite get right, and they need kind of, you have to collect things from certain rooms that will then once you've got them, you can then in that final chamber use them to complete this transformation, which I think is what they want. I don't think they want to be unplantified.
I think I think the balance is that some part of them wants to be wild and violent, and then the other part of them wants to be put to rest. And so the wild and violent part is kind of keeping the solution away. It knows it knows that it's in there.
Yeah, maybe you have like the flowering vines versus the thorny vines, and so you can start to see that like, oh, when the flowering, like a door with flowers opens, it leads to a good thing, and a door with thorns opens, then it leads to a bad thing.
Yeah, something like that. Like that. Yeah, I like that idea of that's the way that the dungeon fizzer communicates with them.
Okay. Nice. Yeah, and then I think within these there'll be like, as I said, one way of formatting it would be to have like kind of and then that's not useful. So it's like first entry, second entry. Or like, I don't know how you say post walls moving. Find some better way of phrasing that, so that it's really clear for the GM. Yeah. Oops. So it's really clear for the GM, like what is different between these two states.
You could call it like, first time layout, and then like shifted layout or something.
Yeah.
Or you could do layout at 1 and layout 2, and it's just like everything starts at layout 1, and then it shifts to layout to its second variation or something. First variation, second variation, something like that. Yeah,
I like layout 1, layout 2. Just for now, while we're figuring it out.
We could leave it as an option too for the GM, like that either layout is a viable choice.
Yeah, because I think it should be reactive to the players, and so I think within each of these rooms there will be, not all of them, but some of them, it's like if they interact with a certain thing or perform a certain action, that will shift the dungeon into layout 2, and so the next room they enter will be something different, but at the same time give GMs options to kind of mess with them, because that's always fun. Okie dokie. So we are closing in on 7 o'clock here. Unless if there are any questions from the chat, we would happily tackle those. Okay. So yeah, I think this is it's a good start. It's very helpful for me because now I can take these notes and go run with it. But this is really really the basic stuff. It can be fun to just kind of jump in and start building a dungeon, but thinking about it kind of carefully beforehand, hopefully will lead to a better dungeon in the end.
I think the repeating thing you'll see in all of these design hangouts is that the more chatting about it and thinking about it and bouncing ideas around you do at the beginning, a lot of the work gets done then, and you will not. The writing part is just getting that done, as opposed to trying to figure things out as you're writing. So draw a little drawing like we did, at least to get your brain going, and then really think about the logistics of the place and the story reasons before you even start writing down A1, A2, A3, because too many people just start with ideas for rooms and then write the next room after that first room, and there isn't a lot of. You can have fun with that, but if you have a message you want to get across or a cohesive story you want to get across, you have to be thinking at the big picture level.
Yeah. One thing you'll note that we haven't talked about at all is like monster CR or like trap damage. Like that's one of the last things that we put in, because you want to have it, the whole thing work as a single piece. So making sure that like it's going to be a challenge over a series of encounters, and you're not just kind of like, oh, this is a CR4 level 4 party, so I'm just going to fill this dungeon with CR4 monsters. We can play with that a lot later on, once we've kind of got the basics locked in.
We're doing that. We have that sentiment with the whole adventure, really, is that we're not worrying too much about the specifics of the monsters because we want to create things that meet the needs of the story. And so the same goes for your dungeons. It's, you design the dungeon and then you will think about the dungeon enough and you'll think, oh, this is what this particular dungeon needs. You can have a lot of fun starting with a monster and building dungeon around it, obviously. But that's still taking a hook at the beginning and building off of it, because a beholder's dungeon versus a dragon's lair is going to be very different. It's going to be different from beholder to beholder even, and from dragon to dragon. So yeah.
Awesome. Once went into a beholder's lair that was a coffee shop. It was fantastic.
They can disintegrate the beans really good.
Yep.
And reheat coffees, I think. They got the heat ray. Yeah.
They were an interesting person. And with that, I think we're going to wrap up here. Thank you so much for joining us. And please, if you haven't checked out our Patreon, you can check it out and see all our playtest material. We've got new playtest material coming out tomorrow. Very exciting. Looking at one of the regions of Weston. So please check that out. Patreon, Hit Point Press. All right.
Thanks for tuning in, everybody.
Thanks. Bye.